Hello and welcome to Open Minds UFO Radio. I am your host, Alejandro Rojas, and I am here with Martin Willis, Moving and Shaken. Martin Moving and Shaken Willis. That's how I'm supposed to say it.
Oh, that's good enough. How'd you know I was shaking? You know I'm moving.
Well, I know you're moving, and I know you're shaking with frustration.
I am.
And anger.
A little bit.
It's not shaking because you want to shake your booty out of fun, like the intention of what moving and shaking is. It is. You're just in the middle of it. It's rough. Moving's one of the hardest things ever.
Well, it shouldn't take more than a week, and that's what it's taken, even with using a crew the other day. And I don't know, I'm at a point in my life where I want to simplify, and I don't, I have antiques and art and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. I feel like putting it in a great big pile and setting it on fire. I don't have an attachment to things like I used to anymore. And when you have to move them, it's
me too.
awful.
I mean, when I move, I will get to a point where I just start trashing box loads of stuff. Because I feel it's
freeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't like. It's not good to be too attached to your material goods and stuff. Anyway.
Well, it's basically not me. It's my my partner that I'm with. She likes to hang on to everything and everything. So it's a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. But before you get me in trouble, I'm going to change the topic.
Well, that's good because I was about to get in trouble. You may be listening.
So, for those of you new to the show, I should mention this every time because I know it causes confusion with people not as familiar with the show. Because luckily, we're getting new listeners all the time. That at the beginning of the show, this first segment, Martin and I will talk some UFO news and joke around and be a little goofy at times. Even though we do cover, credible UFO news and information, but we like to have fun doing it. And then the last two segments are our interview. And our guest today is Micah Hanks. He's best known in this arena for running the podcast, the Gralien Report, which has been around for a long time. I mentioned him quite a bit during the program just because it's his brother that does the opening and close music, Caleb Hanks. They're both very talented musicians. But Micah does other podcasts, and when you hear his voice, you'll hear why. He's got a good radio voice as opposed to my kind of weird voice. But he is a very intelligent person and a great thinker in this field, so he's always a lot of fun to talk to. So I'm excited for you all to hear this interview.
Yeah, I like Micah a lot. He can really, as they say in Radioland, burn some tape.
Yeah,
I mean, he can really do.
He's a talker, but he's very articulate and
he is. Excellent.
And poignant. He's very good at making some great points.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, good guy.
Good dude. So we'll be talking to him in a second, but before we do, let's go ahead and talk about some UFO news. What do you got for us to begin with, my friend?
Well, it's not really UFO, but it could have been to like an animal on the ground seeing. I mean, it could have been a person watching it. And what I'm going to talk about today is about the U.S. and Russian astronauts that they did an emergency landing.
Yeah.
And it's crazy because they just they're really, really lucky to be alive, when something like that happens. And I never even realized that they had this little safety little thing that could shoot out. So anyway, it was two astronauts.
They all do. That's a really important part of the rocket is that the capsule has explosives essentially, and even little thrusters, so they can quickly create space between them and the rocket. So, for instance, sometimes rockets blow up on launch, and the purpose is that hopefully they have the time where it'll trigger and the capsule will be shot into the air and then come down on a parachute, and so they won't be hurt when a rocket explodes or something. But go ahead, yes.
Well, yeah. Well, anyway, so this is the story basically, and I'm reading this off of a Times website. So 2 astronauts from the U.S. and Russia were safe after emergency landing Thursday in the steppes of the Kazakhstan following the failure of a Russian booster rocket carrying them to the International Space Station. They were supposed to dock like 6 hours later, and they didn't quite make it. So NASA astronaut Nick Hague and Roscosmos, I don't know exactly how to say that, Alexei Ochevin, I should have read this thoroughly, Ochevin, a Russian name, lifted off as scheduled at 2:40 p.m., and that's 8:40 GMT. So that was Thursday from the Russia-released Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan atop a Soyuz booster rocket. I'm probably mispronouncing all that stuff, so someone's probably
I know you got Soyuz right. You got rocket right.
Wow. And I spend time in Russia, but I don't read Russian, so I don't know, I don't know if it's close enough.
This was interesting, and there are so many implications. So I'm using my pen. If anybody saw Martin does podcast UFO, which he also puts on YouTube. He does it live on YouTube, and I do the news on his show. And so I was using my rocket pen, which has the Saturn V on it that I got from the U.S. Space Center over in Alabama, and where they have a giant, so you can see videos. I've got videos where we had dinner under this giant Saturn V. So I'm going to use this as a demonstration. You can't see this, but I like to play with my little rocket pen. So, but essentially the rocket launched, and they started feeling weightless. So they're like, I think the rocket is falling back to the planet.
Is that? Wow.
Yeah, and sure enough, it was. So they're like, whoa, we're not supposed to feel weightless. They're supposed to feel actually some mega G's from, the rocket pushing them up into space at extremely fast speeds. So sure enough, the rocket had failed. So they ejected and were able to then float back down to the Earth. I guess one thing that the rocket was at a severe angle, so they were experiencing 7G, which is really high, and it's incredible that they stayed conscious, because at least I haven't heard that they were unconscious, but maybe we haven't heard the full story yet. But typically that'll make someone go unconscious. It would me. So, but they landed and they were fine, thank goodness. But here's the issue. The issue is, as I've covered, like even in a recent story where I talked about the Dragon capsule and the Boeing Starliner, Dragon capsule SpaceX, these are the next spaceships to take humans into, especially Americans, into space, which is important because right now we have to rely on the Russians to take us to the ISS and bring us back, our NASA astronauts. But our contract ends next year. But they're the only game in town. So, and, there's even been a more recent delay. So SpaceX and Boeing aren't going to be ready till, probably late next year to take people to the ISS. So there's a problem because now we've got 3 astronauts up there. There's actually a German, a Russian, and an American on the ISS, but they can't come home. They're supposed to come home on the next Soyuz, which of course was this one, and there's not another one scheduled towards the end of the year. However, we really don't know when the next rocket will go up there, because when an incident like this happens, they have to determine exactly what happened and how to make sure it doesn't happen. And that's a process that can take a very long time. So the Russian rockets are going to be grounded until they can figure this out, which may be, they say if it's something simple, hopefully it'll only be a couple months for them to figure it out, but rarely with rocket issues like this? Is it something simple? So our astronauts might be stuck up there, and even worse, there is an escape capsule on the ISS. So they could take that and come home, and we might need to do that. But it's important that their people be on the ISS for maintenance. So if we don't have anybody on the ISS, it throws the budgeting and everything into flux, nobody knows for sure, and then we have to reevaluate. And this situation could literally kill the ISS. It could be determined that it's not worth the effort and the cost to put people back on the ISS. So we're just going to focus on other efforts and ditch the ISS, because it's about they're talking about they're definitely going to retire it in 2025, and there has been discussion on what to do with it. So it's an interesting situation that we're put in.
Now, is there any shortage of supplies up there? I mean, they must be pretty well stocked, I would think.
Yeah, I think
to be prepared.
Yeah, I think they're good. From what I understand, they're good till early next year.
Still, I would not want to be up there with them. That must be a terrible feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think they're fine. I mean, I think that it might be a little nervous. I mean, one of the things they're going to have to do if they have to take that escape capsule is they're going to have to go through it with a fine tip comb and make sure that it's ready to go. That it's, safe, and they'll have to go examine it and put it through its paces to, their safety inspection and everything. And of course, if they find an issue, then that will be really scary. So
it seems like they, something this important, that they would have some type of backup, it just to have a single.
Well, that capsule is, their backup.
But I mean, like another, another contract.
Like redundant backups type of thing?
Yeah.
Oh, another contract to get up there, too. I know. And, with our current relationship with Russia, that's been an issue. And Russia wants to change. They're changing their whole thing because they were the big game getting rockets and satellites up there. But now that other companies, especially SpaceX, has done so well that they've taken over the market. And so Russia is having to really re-examine and reprioritize their space program. And in fact, they were before we were focused on going back to the moon, they were, which is part of what influenced us also, even though you don't hear much about the political side of things. There was a international political motivation for us to go back to the moon too, because China has been focused on getting back to the moon, and then so did Russia's started, and now we're in the mix. So it's really interesting.
Scary stuff.
Wild stuff. So,
just one more thing about this. So this capsule came back at a really hard angle, and it was almost like they were lucky to survive. There's a film, showing of them, getting them out of the capsule in the middle of the desert. But boy, that is really something.
Yeah, it's scary stuff. I mean, these people are so brave. They
really are.
Know, and they know better than us, just how dangerous what they're doing is. So, it's amazing stuff. I personally, when I was younger, I thought, hell yeah, I'd do it. But now that I'm older, and I think especially when you have, there's a lot of different factors that get into it. I just couldn't do it. First of all, I don't think I can stand, the high G-forces anymore. I used to be like I used to love you go to a music park and you ride a
roller coaster.
I used to love them, but now I can't really take them anymore, let alone, understanding that, hey, you could blow up. This could be it. This is some really crazy stuff.
Yeah.
So other news. Want to get into some other news here?
Sure. What you got?
There's a couple things that I want to talk about. I guess the first thing, just because it's going to become such a big deal, and I don't know if you and I have talked about this, but I do a UFO Live every Thursday at 6 p.m. on YouTube where I talk about UFO news, and I've talked about this in the past, but this has come up more recently because now there is a story in Ars Technica about To the Stars. You know, this group started by Tom DeLonge that includes intelligence people, and it also includes the former chief of what we recently found out was a government UFO program that had been running for many years. That there is an SEC filing that came out that showed there's $37 million behind that in debt. And so people have been freaking out about that. Now, if you look further into the filing, it does say this is due to stock compensation. So I don't think it's real money. You know, I think, in other words, that they generate, you know, when they become public, they generate a certain amount of stock. And so on paper, that their stock is worth X amount. Like, let's say you have 100 shares at, you know, $100 each. That would determine, you know, what that is. And if you haven't sold all those shares, then you're in the red. And I think that's what it's a similar sort of thing. I'm not a lawyer or a accountant, and some other accountants have said that that is kind of what it is on our Open Minds UFO group. But it still is an issue because it does indicate, and it even says this in the SE filing, that they might not be able to exist. They're going to try to continue for a year, but this might be an issue that tanks the company, essentially.
Well, you would think that they would be at least addressing this. Has anything come out from their publicist, you know, answering to what this was going on? No,
and you know what? They're not very proactive when it comes to communication, which I think they should be, because this news has been out there for a week or two. Now, there's not a lot of places that are covering it. I think that, and you know what, to be honest, I don't know of many others. Of course, I've covered it over the last couple weeks, a couple times. But yeah, they could have preempted this issue. Ars Technica didn't mention if they had reached out to the Stars to ask them about it. I think they should have if they didn't. And it looks like actually there's another story on Motherboard about it too that just came out today. So a couple stories. This one I haven't looked at, but someone sent it to me. So I'll have to look at this one in more detail. But the Ars Technica article that I ran across is actually also, it's inaccurate in many cases, as in many parts, which is unfortunate also. So for instance, let me bring it up here. It's called, and it's not a very flattering name, All the Dumb Things, ? Blink 182 frontman UFO project, $37 million in debt. So it talks about his book and, you know, his nonfiction book that came out for Secret. And yeah, you know, it's kind of an Ancient Aliens. It's not really that heavy when it comes to research. So I could see them kind of making fun of that. But otherwise, I don't think this story is really accurate in framing, like, you know, the company and what they're doing. And but
wow,
yeah. So this is kind of scary, actually. I hope to find out more in the not too distant future.
Now, I know you have a connection with a few people there, including you've communicated with Tom.
Yeah.
Is that kind of an embarrassing thing to reach out and ask, I guess?
Exactly. So I've been a little hesitant to do that. And I know they're busy with a really big project right now. Fairly recently, I mean, I've gotten some short messages like 2 responses, and I'm supposed to have a couple longer calls here soon. But I'm definitely going to ask when I'm able to get on a phone call. I just haven't been able to do that yet. So, yeah, because I think that it would be good for them to get in front of this and kind of frame it. Right. Even if it's to say, yes, we're, things are not looking great for us, but what this means and what this means for our future. I mean, that'd be helpful for people to know. And I think that investors are probably really scared.
I mean, if you don't talk about it, you cause, suspicion and, speculation and conspiracies and all that. It's best just to address it right up front if you can. Yeah,
especially when major media gets a hold of it. And if they're not representing it accurately, then really kind of have you could. That's why you got to get in front of these things and, put your spin or at least your take on things before others start to do it. Yeah, so hopefully, let's see, this might become a big story because people like to fun of course, this sort of stuff that they think might be kind of frivolous or silly. But we'll see.
Right.
Definitely not positive. But otherwise, another thing that's happening right now is New York Comic Con happened last weekend, not just, yesterday, but a couple, week ago, or a little more than a week ago. And a big presence there was History Channel's Project Blue Book. And so this week we got a lot of stories about the History Channel television show Project Blue Book, which is going to, be about the U.S. government's investigation into UFOs in the late 40s up until the late 60s. And the scientific consultant, astronomer Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was a skeptic of UFOs and then became, as he helped the Air Force investigate, became interested in and saw this as a legitimate mystery. In fact, he started the Center for UFO Research. He coined the phrase close encounters to explain the different types of UFO research. Of course, that's the movie was named after that, the Spielberg movie. And so he's going to be like the main character. Now, it's fictional. So, and for instance, they're going to have Hynek investigating cases he didn't really investigate. They're going to have him, kind of looking for some kind of major conspiracy going on behind the scenes, which is at least nothing that he shared that he did. However, some people suspect perhaps, there was information being hidden. In fact, when Blue Book was closed, I think it's called the Bollinger Memo. I can't remember the exact name of the memo, but you can find it on openminds.tv when you look at the Air Force and military. We have a video on our YouTube about it too. But this memo said, that's okay if you close Blue Book because the most important cases we send somewhere else anyway. So they were investigating cases outside of Blue Book. But anyway, the show is depicting real UFO cases, which is pretty exciting, I think. And the History Channel has been writing legit news stories about some of these old cases, and they're great stories. But yeah, there's been a bunch of media about this upcoming show, which is
I see that.
exciting.
That's what when I looked for stories today, I saw several, stories about the upcoming project, which is great.
Yeah. The only last thing I'll say is Nick Pope came out with a new documentary called Aliens in the Pentagon.
Oh, yeah.
Nick Pope's great. He worked for the Ministry of Defense. In fact, he's got an article today about To the Stars in The Guardian, which is a UK paper. But he worked for the Ministry of Defense, the British Ministry of Defense, investigating UFOs in the 90s. And like Hynek and like many other, like Elizondo, were skeptical when they began their investigations, but came out thinking, wow, there's really something to this. The reviews haven't been so great because it looks like they use lots of stock images and stock footage that they repeat through the video, which is unfortunate, kind of amateurish. But Nick Pope is great. I mean, he's a very intelligent person, and I think has a lot of great things to say. So, yeah.
Well, great. When does that actually get released?
It's already released, I guess. So, yeah, we have a link to the story about it, but at openminds.tv. But we're out of time.
Wow. All right.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Martin.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Let's go ahead and talk with Micah Hanks right after this break. I am very happy to welcome back to the show Micah Hanks. It's been a while, I think.
Yeah, it absolutely has. I have seen you more recently in real life than it has been an occasion for us to catch up on this podcast when we were, of course, out there in Wyoming together a few weeks ago. So it's only proper that we actually do another show together as well. Good to be here.
Well, and I did those interviews, where we talked about close encounters, and hopefully you've seen those. I posted those on YouTube.
Yeah, not only have I seen those videos you did, and they turned out great, by the way, but when I went back and I watched it, and I was hearing all this commentary about the famous film, Close Encounters, Steven Spielberg, I was like, what in the world was I thinking not watching that before I went to Devil's Tower? And the broader question, of course, that many probably already have in their minds is, how could he not have seen it, to begin with? So I did go back and watch it, and yeah, it's a great film.
Oh, so you did watch it. That's funny, because in a way it was kind of good that you hadn't watched it, at least for the piece, and I like that, because to me, it's kind of shocking, and it's been something that's in the last year since the last Devil's Tower, is talking to the people who hadn't seen it, and it's mostly younger people, so you kind of represented this group of people who had never seen it. But so it was interesting to hear your comments, because it still was culturally significant. Like, people know it exists and it's out there, but they just hadn't seen it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that kind of mirrors a broader thing that I see, Alejandro, with regard to at least my own experience with the UFO subject. A lot of people talk to me and they're like, you were a child of the 90s. Growing up, you must have watched, films like Close Encounters. You probably were a huge fan of the X-Files. And, yeah, it's always funny, because I guess there's this tremendous letdown when I tell people, no, actually, I had never watched X-Files. I never saw Close Encounters. I did own E.T. on VHS, and I didn't really, when I was a child, I didn't enjoy the film as much as I do now. Now I can go back and watch, again, what you'd consider classic cinema of my childhood. And, that's what I call the golden age of special effects. Special effects reached this kind of epitome of realness. The clarity and the genuine nature of the appearance was great. It was fun, but it hadn't gotten to the point of CGI where, CGI in its infancy didn't always look all that great. And so I think those films from the 80s and early 90s are a special era where things looked as good as they were going to look before CGI came along. But now I go back and I love those shows and all those films, but they weren't the things that got me into ufology. The things that got me into ufology were actual books and studies pertaining to unusual things seen in the sky.
Right, which makes a lot of sense, which is actually better, because movies aren't real. Whereas the books and the information, and I always have felt, personally, and I would love to hear your thoughts as well, is that reality, like they say, truth is much stranger than fiction. And it's true. The real stories are so much more exciting than I feel, for the most part, than what we see on television.
Well, yeah, certainly. And again, you got to be really careful when you enjoy the fantastical kind of representations in fiction and film of these sort of subjects. You got to be careful that those interpretations through fantasy don't color the way that you look at the possible reality underlying some of it. A good example of that I've kept with me for years, and this is a film from the 90s that I remember very vividly because it was so scary to me at that time, Fire in the Sky. Based on the famous experiences of Travis Walton, our friend. And, when you meet Travis, or you see him give a lecture these days, and he points out all the differences between that film and his actual experience, and anyone who's read his book is probably already familiar with those things, as I kind of was. It's a great example of how a popular representation through film and fantasy of this subject can often not only have a very different kind of a vibe and presentation than the actual subject does, but it can be scary, and it can also dissuade viewers or mislead people into thinking that there's one thing going on or that it's this horrific kind of a thing. To me, ufology isn't really that. And although I don't deal very much in the close encounter side of it, I'm interested in the tangible idea of there being objects in the sky and how science can be applied to the study of them. Again, I've always, I think, been aware, thanks in part to films like that and what guys like Travis have to say about his actual experiences, that you've got to be careful about letting the fantastical element color your perceptions of the phenomena. So yeah, I agree with you. It's kind of maybe beneficial, at least if you're speaking for myself here, that I didn't, get entirely saturated with that kind of media growing up. I came into this kind of going, what's this all about? And now I got to catch up and go back and watch all the movies.
Mm-hmm. Well, Close Encounters, that's about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the fire in the sky. And I guess... I think, I don't know, I would love to hear your thoughts. And I almost think that a lot of times when people are presented with a large amount of mystery or unknown, that it's a little bit of overload. And I think we all do this when it comes to technology and things that we just don't completely understand, is that we acknowledge it and kind of move on with our lives. And I was thinking of this last night when I was watching the Hunt for the Skinwalker documentary again with some friends, and someone, and they didn't even say who said this, but about if we let people know there'd be too much and they'd be overwhelmed. And I don't think people work like that. It's almost like this, a breaker that we all have. Like when our brains, when we get confronted with a lot of unknown, we just kind of turn off and don't ignore it. It's just like, well, I'm not going to be able to comprehend all of that, so I'll acknowledge kind of that it's there and just kind of move on with my life.
Right. Yeah. And we'll have to talk about Mr. Corbell's film here a little later, because I recently watched it too. But there are a lot of dimensions to what you're talking about right there. And again, let's bring it back down to the idea of the fact versus the fantasy. You see what appears in films, and it is again, it's intended to be in your face and overtly otherworldly, with again, representations of alien beings and in the interior of very advanced spacecraft from other planets and things like this. And you see this not only in E.T. and Close Encounters, but of course more recent films like Independence Day, although that's still from that same era. Again, throughout the ages, we could continue to name them all the way up to the stuff that you're seeing like The Arrival in theaters right now, or at least a couple of years ago. You know what I mean? There are all these different interpretations of what eventual contact with alien life might be like. And then if you move over into the paradigm of reality, where people report seeing unusual things sometimes, whether that be a light in the sky, and it's a very kind of a vague experience that could be any number of things, and a lot of it is really fundamentally based on the interpretation, the filters of human interpretation. One person might see a light in the distance and say star or airplane. Another person might say, aircraft from Zeta to Reticuli. That's really, I think, what for me got me into looking at psychology in relation to all of this. The idea that memories sometimes can be updated, and that people can, although they don't intend to do it, it seems to be a function of memory that over time people will kind of update their experiences, and that leads to the misremembering of things, confabulation. So that's one element that has to be considered too. But in relation to people not being able to handle it, or it being like a complete mental overload, and that's speaking about really the UFO experience in the moment as it's happening, and then immediately thereafter, I don't think that people just wouldn't be able to handle it. If you actually talk with UFO witnesses and people who have seen even more extraordinary things that they would again describe as being a tangible, structured craft, for instance, many people will describe being curious or even frightened at the time. And you've probably heard this time and time again, Alejandro, that many years later it's brought up in a conversation and they're like, oh, yeah, I forgot all about that. I saw that thing too. I saw a triangle-shaped object, or I saw this or that. And then they'll remember all of a sudden. It's like this flood of memories comes back, and they describe feeling whatever they felt at the time. But often that experience, due to its weirdness, is kind of more like a hiccup, like a novel, oh, that's weird. And then they kind of move on and forget about it, rather than this paradigm shift. It seems actually far less common that people describe a life-changing experience when they've seen a so-called UFO than the people who kind of see it, duly noted, move on, forget about it maybe, and then it's brought up again years later. Remember, by the way, a good example of this, Kurt Russell coming out in that interview a couple of years ago saying, hey, I was the pilot who reported seeing the Phoenix Lights. You remember that?
I do very well, and I think you make a great point, because it also reminds me, and I'm sure you've heard this as well, often when people are like, I was with a group of people and we saw this object and I was just shocked and I was so surprised, and I went to my buddies and I was like, do you guys see this? And they're like, yeah. And I was like, well, I don't know what that is. And they were like, yeah, I don't know what it is either. And they didn't seem to really care, and it was extraordinary, and I couldn't believe that they didn't care. I mean, you hear this so often, that like one person out of the group really had much of an impact.
Yeah. Another iteration of that kind of, the varieties of the UFO experience through human interpretation is one, and I think it's best encapsulated in the context of a story that a friend of mine who was a scholar shared with me a number of years ago. And he had two other friends who they all three had PhDs, but I think that, one was a humanities professor, one was actually a physicist or an astronomer. I don't remember what the vocation of the other was. They're all three sitting there at a cookout, and one of them brings up, it may have been the astronomer, brings up the idea of UFOs and says, what do you think about that? And there's one of them among the three that is really skeptical, and he says to my friend and the other fella, oh, come on, are you really going to bring that up? Well, my friend mentions having had an experience seeing something, and so did the astronomer. And then the skeptic among the three PhDs goes, well, in truth, actually, and I don't know what it was, and he starts to tell his own story too. So in the context of a conversation with fellow academics, he initially downplayed the idea in a skeptical fashion, because that was, I think, the response that he expected he should give. But then when he found out he was in the company of two fellow experiencers, if you want to call them that, then he shares his own experience, the skeptic. So that's an interesting thing too, because I think that many people kind of judge their experience based on the paradigm of belief or skepticism. Often when people find out I'm interested in UFOs, they say, I believe they're up there. I believe we've been visited. They say things like that, which, again, in that context, obviously denote, the idea of alien visitation. And, if I spend more than 5 minutes talking with somebody, a lot of the time it's just kind of nodding and saying, that's neat, interesting. I want to hear what people have to say, but very seldom does the conversation progress to a point where I actually describe what I think about this subject. And I often have to tell people, if we do get that far, that, I'm not really necessarily talking about aliens here. When we talk about unidentified flying objects, I mean precisely that. Now, there are other interpretations that go beyond that. And that's, by the way, Alejandro, something that I really did enjoy about being out in Wyoming, that, with you there, David Marler, Mark D'Antonio, some of the great speakers, Karen as well. I mean, all these folks who are coming at this from different perspectives and angles, but nonetheless, the approach was very scholarly, and I think everyone was trying to kind of reserve judgment in terms of what this phenomena actually is. So, again, the varieties of interpretation, I mean, they're almost too many to count, but you have to look at the psychological side of this too, and the reasons for human belief in relation to the subject in order to understand it in the broader sense.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I love getting into this area. And this is something that, I know that you're interested in, and I am very much so also, because we come from a similar perspective, because I feel exactly like you do. People talking about UFOs, assuming they're alien, and then eventually if they ask, educating them that, about what a UFO actually means. And like you said, the researchers there at the Devil's Tower were all very careful about this. And it's something that, is really important is, and I know you're like this too, you're careful about the words that you choose and their definitions, and you even correct yourself or add information to clarify your point. But I find myself, and I think it's important for us all to do so, is to make that definition with UFOs. I'm talking about unidentified. I'm talking about something mysterious. We don't know what it is, but not necessarily jumping to the conclusion that it's alien or from another planet.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, I think that, and again, maybe you would share a similar experience too, but over the years, taking that approach seems to have made a lot of opportunities for me to talk with people who I believe to be very credible witnesses. I mean, people who, frankly, I've also in some instances formed relationships with, and that allows me to trust them more or less implicitly and explicitly. I mean, they are good people, and I'll give you a couple of really good examples. One of my colleagues in the historical and archaeological research that I do with my guys with 7 Ages, and of course that's a whole different dimension of what I do, but the 7 Ages research team and I are interested in mysteries of the past, and not, necessarily very sensational stuff. I mean, we're talking about North American archaeology, geology, and things like this, and so it's very fitting we've got a geologist on our team, but he's also, and this is James Waldo, who was a guest, incidentally, last week on my Gralien Report podcast. But James also served many, many years in the U.S. Army, and he was stationed in Iraq. And while he was there, late one night, he actually observed a large triangle-shaped aircraft. And he didn't know exactly what it was. And he even recalls emailing John Greenwald and, describing this experience. And we were talking about this, and while we were traveling last week, he and our mutual friend Jason Pentrail, also with the team, the three of us are traveling through parts of Georgia and Alabama, and we met up with a friend of mine. I'd known him for a while, but I met him for the first time over the weekend, and that was Lash LaRue. That's the former pro wrestler, WCW and WWE. And so it was really kind of an interesting, a motley crew, you might say, but we brought up James's encounter. And lo and behold, here's my former pro wrestler friend Lash saying, I saw one of those too. And then he shares his experience right down there near the Talladega Motor Speedway, seeing a black triangle-shaped aircraft. He said it was maybe about the size of a school bus, hovering silently. And they noticed it in the sky, and they thought, what is that? He, his brother, and I believe it was his wife. It was the third witness there with him. And they said that they looked up at it, and they saw it, and that only just a few moments after they noticed it, it took off very quickly, but it had been hovering in the sky, completely silent, jet black. And again, it's interesting that not only is there continuity between the reports, but again, if you approach, and I find that, again, discussing this subject with people in the context of, I wonder if there are experimental aircraft, I wonder if there are unusual things in the sky, along the lines of some sort of a technology that maybe, on the civilian level we aren't aware of. So phrasing the concept in those terms and not leaping to conclusions. Ancient aliens visiting Earth, for millennia, seeding humanity here on planet Earth, not going to the depths of, again, what I think kind of steps over into the fantastical realm, for me has yielded pretty good results. And again, that's something that we saw out there in Wyoming. I mentioned these triangle aircraft. There are just a plethora of really, I think, very good reports indicating that these aircraft, whatever they are in different sizes, but certainly maintaining that triangular shape, do exist. Best evidenced, of course, I think, by the research of our colleague David Marler. And it's a fascinating element within the UFO, the broader UFO phenomena, that really seems to point at something very consistent from case to case that's going on.
Right. Yeah. And I think you brought up something else that's also really interesting, which is the skeptics. And I think this is important, especially for you and I, because we are, especially in this field, at least speaking for myself, and I think you can identify, considered a skeptic often, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but, there are those skeptics who essentially are kind of contrarians, essentially, and it almost seems like kind of in it for the battle, which kind of sounds like your friend you had mentioned before. But what's fascinating with many of those people who just fight tooth and nail to refuse that, there's any sort of mystery, at least to battle intellectually with those of us who think that there is a genuine mystery, but often their interest is rooted in an experience that they rarely feel comfortable enough to share, like your friend had, which you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's true also. And, while we're discussing the idea of psychology, credibility, phrasing the UFO subject in a way that is both credible, which is conducive not only to communicating to others about it, but also in terms of being able to kind of field for better data, from people that you might encounter who have had similar experiences. It's important to address, modern skepticism in regard to all this too, because, I've got a lot of friends in the skeptical community who I really appreciate. I mean, some of them have at times offered critiques of my work, which has led to broader conversation and I think sharing of ideas, tightening of some of my own. Eric Wojciechowski's one guy that comes to mind. Robert Schaefer, who often attends the UFO congresses. Both of these guys I've corresponded with over the years. We may not always agree, like Bob Schaefer and I, for instance, but we definitely appreciate, I think, having a more rational approach, and we like to correspond, and I certainly appreciate some of his work. I may not agree with everything, all the conclusions that he comes to. I do think that there are aircraft which are unaccounted for, wherever they may be from. And I don't think that that's a far-out proposition. I'm also open to more far-out ideas, but I mean, that's pending further evidence, and that's where I think you and I get labeled skeptics too, which I really don't mind. And on that subject of using the term skeptic, again, many people say big S skeptic and little s skeptic. I've called myself a skeptic for years, but I'm kind of getting away from that, Alejandro, and I'll tell you why. It's not because I'm trying to become a person who wants to validate fringe claims or be called a believer or whatever else. It really has more to do with me just not liking the labels at all. I think that's kind of the problem. Once you start calling yourself a skeptic or a believer, I find that people who use terms to identify themselves and orient themselves with the subject tend to kind of begin falling into a bit of a cult of personality. Not all of them, but it does happen from time to time where, I'm a skeptic and I'm going to be more skeptical. And I've caught myself doing this too, just being more prone to rule something out of hand without doing good historical and scientific research in the name of falling in step with a skeptical approach and attitude. And so, at least for my own part, I actually like to kind of, move away from those labels and just say, look, I'm just going to try and be as unbiased about this as possible, open-minded but skeptical in approach, so that I can, again, falsify, the evidence if necessary and take a scientific approach toward further inquiry and not try to prove so much as disprove what may represent a phenomena. And it's much easier in most cases, as you know, to disprove or to falsify extraordinary claims. It's those few cases, though, that come, that come along every few years or so, where there's an accumulation of really good data. One that David Marler and I both talked about out there in Wyoming had been the St. Clair County incident from 2000, which involved a number of police officers that observed a large triangular-shaped aircraft early in the morning. And not only did they all observe it, one of them got a really terrible photograph of it too, but, and this is key, they were describing the object in real time via police dispatch, and those recordings were later released to the public. And David Marler goes even deeper into that case in his book on triangular UFOs, An Estimate of the Situation, where he talks about the fact that he was able to eventually get information about air traffic control info and data from that evening in question, not from Scott Air Force Base, but from the regional airport there. They did release some information about their actual radar, but what they did not apparently have access to at that time was information about whether or not the military had been tracking it. They did tell David Marler that an outside agency had requested the information as well, which seems to indicate that they did have an interest and were trying to get further details, despite saying they knew nothing about what the aircraft was and had no reports of it being there. So again, through some of the detective work that guys like Marler have done, and then also just the information that was released with regard to police dispatch recordings about that incident, we have pretty good descriptions of an object, very large, consistent in shape, seen at around the same time, and by a number of different police officers from different areas in southern Illinois. And again, to me, that's a really good case that I think holds water, so to speak. It gives us a lot of details about this object, and it kind of helps remove, coming back to that psychological idea of updating memory over time. With the descriptions given in real time, it gives us a pretty good idea of what they were looking at, albeit the fact that it was dark when it occurred, but nonetheless, this thing did have some lights on it. It gives us a pretty good description of the object that is a record, that we can go back to and we can refer to in hindsight and say, well, this is how they described it as the officers were seeing it. And so we can be pretty sure, based on the continuity between the descriptions given in real time on those recordings, that, this is what it probably looked like. But those kind of good cases don't come along often. That's really, I think, the truth of UFO research, isn't it?
Yeah, and you have, there's a couple really good points there that I want to touch on, but it's time for us to take our first break. So we're already to the halfway point. Time flies, but which I knew it would, talking to you, because time flies all the time when we get in these conversations. But let's go ahead and take a quick break. For those of you listening on KGRA, you'll hear a commercial break. Those of you listening to the podcast will hear a short musical interlude, and we will return shortly with Micah Hanks. back to Open Minds UFO Radio. I'm your host, Alejandro Rojas, and we're here with Micah Hanks. And, you know, I think you brought up something interesting with you trying to not pigeonhole yourself. And I think that is a bit of an issue with this kind of particular area of study also. There's always a set of assumptions. Like, I think, you know, when, for instance, if you take the researchers at the conference at Devil's Tower, all of us who were there, we all respect each other's work. We're very fascinated in what we all have to say and our points of view. But, you know, we're all individuals with different perspectives on a lot of different things. In fact, Mark and I, even in the middle of somebody's talk, got in probably David Marler's, who brought up a case or something, and we had a little bit of a debate, and then came to an agreement after a few minutes. But that's the point, you know, that I think, and if you pigeonhole yourselves or put yourself in a camp, then, like you said, you know, I think people can then tend to want to jump on the bandwagon as opposed to, you know, taking an independent look and making their own determination.
Well, absolutely. And, you know, speaking of these bandwagons and preconceptions about what UFOs are, or, you know, what the best way to go about being a UFO researcher is, I mean, again, those preconceptions are actually projected onto UFO researchers. Mm-hmm. Well, the first time I came out and spoke at the International UFO Congress, you know, I remember that there was a mixed attitude in relation to the talk I gave, just to use myself as an example here. And part of the reason why is because I've always tried to apply philosophy and in specific a little, you know, epistemological kind of reckoning of sorts to ufology. In other words, how do we apply philosophically the concept of how do we know what we know about this subject to the broader idea of UFOs? I mean, asking that fundamental epistemological question of, well, how do we know what we know, or what we claim to know about UFOs? That is the first step toward, I think, you know, unmarrying yourself to the alien idea or any other pet theory and beginning to really take on a more objective approach toward the subject. And although I've always identified that objectivity as skepticism, I think, again, it's healthy at times also to try and unmarry yourself from, you know, the disposition of skepticism, so that you don't become biased in that regard either. I mean, to really truly be objective in studying this phenomena, nobody ever said it was easy. And again, psychology and philosophy are things that really come into play with it. But trying to bring that kind of discussion and dialogue to the subject got, like I said, mixed reviews when I first started giving lectures at bigger conferences about this kind of stuff, and especially among, and I would say, you know, researchers and also enthusiasts who are several decades older than me. And I remember one or two of them coming up to me after the talk I gave, and I was standing there with Richard Dolan, and this fellow said, "I'm really surprised the two of you are friends." And Richard's like, "What do you mean? Why wouldn't we be friends? You know, Richard and I, you know, we don't always see eye to eye either, but we are very good friends, and we respect each other and the work that each of us does." And this fellow says, "Well, you know, Micah here, he just talks about philosophy and about, you know, belief and psychology and things like that in relation to this subject, and yet there aren't any real details. This guy doesn't give us any real details about cases." And Richard, you know, on the other hand, has done all this historical work and analysis. And it's like, you know, first of all, you guys are from completely different paradigms. And second of all, I'm not sure what Micah there does is even ufology. Well, Richard disagreed pretty adamantly. And he said, no, you know, what Micah's doing is a different approach, but it's just as necessary as what I do. And I'm sure that people have probably said that to Richard too. You know, you aren't a real investigator. You aren't getting out there and actually doing investigations or whatever. You're just a guy who reads history books and tries to put all this in the context of government and politics and things like that. But that's the whole thing, is that, you know, it seems like at some point all the good UFO researchers, or rather those who aspired to be good UFO researchers, they were all trying to emulate, I guess, what guys like Stanton Friedman had done. You know, go to the National Archives, dig up as much historical resource material as they could, and put together this watertight, or waterproof, you know, argument in relation to one case or another case, you know, Roswell or whatever else. And that's one approach. Historical analysis, you know, like that is one approach to studying this phenomena. Then there's, again, what guys like, you know, my colleague in Australia, Paul Dean, do. Almost all their research is based around filing Freedom of Information Act requests to government. Again, John Greenwald, who we mentioned earlier, he's really the Mac Daddy as far as that goes. He's been doing it since he was a teenager with the Black Vault. Then there's the side of it where someone might analyze this phenomena culturally, philosophically, psychologically, like I tend to do, because I want to understand how human belief influences and not only an experience with UFOs, but also how in the broader idea of culture, especially in the Western world, how that interpretation of the phenomena and expectations in relation to it color the actual research. You see that too. And so all of these perspectives are very important. And I don't think that you can say that there's one way to do ufology, and it's got to be just like how Stanton Friedman did it, or it's not really ufology.
It's so funny. I agree with you 100%. And I was in a conversation like this recently, and there was a skeptic, and essentially it was about statistics. In fact, this person was arguing about Cheryl Costa, and she writes for Syracuse New Times, and she writes a lot about the statistics regarding the MUFON reports. And he was like, we can't just look at these numbers. You can't just look at the nuts and bolts like what To the Stars is doing. There's so much. What about, the cultural things? What about the social sciences? And this person was in social sciences, and they were attacking me as if I was saying, no, you have to only do it this way. And I think it was a bit surprised, and that I was like, I'm agreeing with you. I totally agree that, just like you said, there are so many different ways. There's so many different disciplines that need to be involved with looking into this. And in fact, I want to go a different direction than people normally go with you in a minute. But just the same thing, and it was just kind of funny, the skeptic coming at me like, why aren't you guys doing this and this? And which is a little bit frustrating, because it's like, who's you guys? I'm just a me, first of all, so I can't represent the entire field. And second of all, I agree with you, and that it does take a multidisciplinary, approach to really, truly look at all of this.
Absolutely. And again, that's why I enjoy the writing of guys like NASA historian James Oberg, for instance, as much as I enjoy reading your stuff or David Marler's stuff. I mean, I don't pick a certain ideology or a certain researcher or a certain pet theory and put everything I study in relation to this subject, or any subject for that matter, because UFOs are they're like the pinky on the broader hand of my interests,
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, whatever the subject is I'm interested in, I don't just narrow my focus so much, because I do think that while there's merit to being a specialist, if you really want to understand this phenomena, there are a variety of approaches that must be applied. And so, again, I think it's really important that although people should be, I prefer when people are scientifically inclined, and I could go off, wasting time really naming things that I think are unproductive in relation to methods of inquiry for UFOs. Sitting around singing Kumbaya and trying to raise our chakras or something like that and call down aliens. I might say that that's on the lesser end of importance when it comes to how science can be applied to UFO research. But I do think that an interdisciplinary approach where specialists with different backgrounds and areas of interest work together and try and compare everything from, analytical science to, psychology, nuts and bolts historical research, and also field investigation that involves physical trace evidence, what little can be gleaned in terms of UFO reports. All these things working together are the best approach to trying to understand this phenomena. I do not think, however, being so skeptical that you just say, no, it isn't, no, it can't, no, it doesn't, there is nothing to see here, shut up, quit talking about it. That's not a constructive way of going about trying to study this either. So again, I fundamentally think being scientific is the best approach to studying UFOs.
Mm-hmm. So I want to kind of move away from that, even though that's a whole topic, and that would be really interesting to talk about. How do we scientifically study UFOs? But we don't have time for that conversation, quite frankly. So maybe we'll talk about that later. And I really want to go a different direction, which is, I think, something unique about a more unique perspective, which is, I am really, when I view myself and what I do, I feel more like a futurist, in that I love to write about space and space technology, space tourism. And for me, the idea of UFOs and UFO research kind of fits in that. And so for you, you call, your Gralien Report, your tagline is "The future is now." And I guess that indicates that, you know, what you're thinking of is this idea of what the future is. You know, how does that pertain to what you do?
Oh, that's a really good question. And again, every time I sit down and talk with you and I start comparing notes, I realize how much more alike we are than I ever realized. And so, yeah, at one time, especially when I really started trying to get serious about my inquiries into the UFO subject, I actually began, that's when I added that tagline, "The future is now." And I actually at times have referred to myself also as a futurist, because I'm not just interested in the future of aerospace. Also, I'm interested in artificial intelligence, and I keep a very close eye on developments in that area because I think that it is both a promising element that may arise in the not too distant future, technologically speaking, but it is also something that bears potential for harm. And so, and really, you know, I mean, it doesn't seem to be the case that UFO phenomena in any way has communicated to us any kind of threat. And so I don't necessarily apply the same sort of existential concerns to ufology that I would something like artificial intelligence, etc. But I at least reserve judgment on leaping to the conclusion that there's no danger or existential concerns that should be associated with it. And in fact, there are plenty of them that we could talk about. So all those things kind of do put me in the futurist camp in that regard, although it's funny, I told Jason Pentrail, my colleague with 7 Ages, again, we do history and archaeology with that team, and we have a podcast associated with that too, and I do another show called Middle Theory, which is all about news and current events, and I said to him, it's like each podcast deals with a different era. It's like, you know, 7 Ages is the past, Middle Theory is the present, and Gralien Report is the future. So you might say I'm a bit of a time traveler in the sense that I look at all eras as it relates to history, past, present, and future. But I definitely think that understanding trends technologically and otherwise that we're seeing right now and what the idea of tomorrow is shaping up to be can help us in relation to studying UFOs. There's that old adage, I guess, Alejandro, that you hear from time to time, which has to do with, you know, anything that the government's working on right now. You know, the civilian level isn't going to hear about it for another 30 years. Which implies that there are technologies, again, that's just a ballpark figure, and I'm using an anecdote, but I mean, one might say that there are probably, in likelihood, technologies that, again, on the civilian level, we don't know about that are maybe 30 years or so, give or take, in advance of what we know to exist. And so, in that sense, the future really is right now. And I think that it definitely, at very least, summarizes part of the issue that we see with UFOs, because we appear to be dealing with a technology that is at least a few years in advance of us. Now, many people would say, in order to be able to get here from another planet, again, kind of operating within the alien or ET paradigm, I mean, they'd have to be hundreds, maybe thousands of years in advance of us. But the technology, at very least in terms of, and this is a supposition, so we've got to be careful as we deal in the realm of speculation here, the technology does not appear necessarily to be hundreds of years, centuries or more ahead of us. It really, I think, seems more like it's in the realm of decades. And there are weird little things that come up in the context of UFO literature that seem to point to this. For instance, a really quick one has to do with Betty and Barney Hill. And during their alleged abduction experience back, decades ago, Betty specifically described a pregnancy test in which a needle was injected into her abdomen, and she was, she perceived this as being a pregnancy test. It was described as being similar to what is known as amniocentesis, which is, at that time, in fact, actually, it would have been sort of nascent technology. By today's standards, it's considered fairly archaic. And yet it was described in the context of an abduction experience where a woman claimed that this occurred to her. And so the reason that's significant, and Nick Redfern and other researchers have pointed that out, is we didn't see some sort of advanced technology with lasers or holograms or something like that. We saw something that was just a few years ahead of what the state-of-the-art technology at that time actually was. And you might say similar things, and we could, again, go off on a tangent, but I'd rather save the time here. But applying that kind of observation to broader ufology, in terms of what is the state of the art of this technology, whatever it is, where is it from? All indications point to the idea that it's something that's more relatively close to where we are today than what we would expect, perhaps, from alien technology centuries or thousands of years in advance of us. I hope that kind of makes sense. But again, in that kind of framework, looking at the technology that we expect of the next few decades, I think can be very informative for us in terms of trying to interpret UFO phenomena that is, described by experiencers today.
And I think this gets us back to a couple things, but one of them being the Hunt for the Skinwalker video, because getting back to what you're talking about here is that, when you get into the nitty-gritty of the phenomena, it is very confounding, like they found with their Skinwalker investigations in Jeremy's documentary, or in the George Knapp book, Hunt for the Skinwalker. And it kind of then, it's one of the reasons I like to look at the peripheral issues as well, because the confounding nature of the phenomena has an effect on people, and it often an emotional effect. And I think even the confounding nature of the phenomena itself often kind of creates these tensions and problems with people involved with this stuff communicating with each other, because we're trying to interpret something that might not be interpretable for us right now.
Right. That's a very good point. Again, it's so often said, it's almost blasé, but Arthur C. Clarke talking about, any significantly advanced technology as observed by a lesser advanced, technological group or civilization will be perceived as magic. And it very well may be that certain things that we liken today to spiritual phenomena or experiences that really fall outside the paradigm of what science can explain, and therefore are often relegated to myth or superstition. It very well may be further on down the road that we'll recognize those things as technologies in and of themselves at some point, but we aren't to that point where we understand them and therefore they seem magical. Arthur Clarke, again, a very wise futurist who tried to anticipate future developments. And if you go back and watch videos of him, he predicted the internet. He predicted news and media taking, moving over into the web, and, economic and social considerations in relation to all that. It's really fascinating watching old videos of Arthur C. Clarke. But I think that, again, it's important to take all these things into consideration because of the way that, like you said, the phenomena that we perceive as described in anecdotal instances, reports, by those who claim to be experiencers, it does have a confounding effect in many instances. And that was probably best displayed during some of the phenomena described there at the so-called Skinwalker Ranch. And I just got to give Jeremy Corbell props for an excellent job he did on that documentary. I didn't just rent it. I bought a copy because I wanted to support him and also be able to refer back to it and watch it many times, as I know that you have. Excellent documentary, some excellent archival footage, and through the conversations between Corbell and George Knapp, it also, I think, very effectively anticipated some of the developments that have come out in relation to the now famous Pentagon UFO study. In fact, right at the very end, I don't want to give anything away, and so we're in the spoiler-free zone here. Let me just say, folks, and if Jeremy's listening again, I just want to congratulate him. But at the very end of the film, there are some references made to the idea of a broader, like a parent organization within the Pentagon around the so-called Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And lo and behold, now that the film's out, we have learned about something along those lines. And so I won't say much more about that. I want people to go watch Jeremy's film. It's really, really good. Excellent documentary. But definitely we're starting to see already some developments that were discussed in that film, which effectively, I think, anticipated some developments in relation to the Pentagon group's UFO inquiries, which that's been a fascinating little subdivision of ufology in itself.
It has been. And just so the listeners know, on YouTube, you can get more of Micah's perspective. I've got a lot of great positive comments about your point of view also. On the Open Minds YouTube, one of the videos that I did is where we talked about, how we all felt about that program and the effects of that program. And so you can go to YouTube and watch that video of us talking about that at the Devil's Tower. But my last question, because we're really out of time, so it'll have to be brief. But if you could make a comment, and you spoke to it just a minute ago, but it almost feels like, I know you, as well as I look at kind of the impact of this phenomena on the public, and, you know, with you, larger other phenomena, it's interesting, and I just would love a comment on how it seems this conversation, especially about UFOs, is becoming such a larger conversation and is actually right now, I think, influencing the larger culture more than I would have expected it to.
Yeah, it certainly has. I have to say that, again, public knowledge of ongoing UFO inquiry by the Pentagon has kind of reinvigorated the debate. I am an author. I've written books on this subject, but I'm equally wary, despite having colleagues and friends who have written excellent books that I enjoy reading. I'm wary of a kind of culture industry being built around a subject where it's just people writing books about this or that and going to conferences, giving talks, and trying to sell those books. I mean, UFO research, and I think that my good author friends would completely agree. They're very aware of this too. You know, it needs more than that. It needs more than a culture industry. And so knowledge of a government program sponsored by taxpayer dollars, endorsed by senators, and, of course, being undertaken and perhaps still underway right now, in that capacity, it removes the subject of UFOs in the mind of the public from a culture industry and into an actual serious subject that our government has looked at. And that is a very meaningful development in terms of recent UFO research.
Right. Yes. So we'll keep looking into the future, but the time flew. Oh my gosh. I can't, it's whenever it's an interesting conversation, the time flies quicker than usual. It feels like we've only been talking a couple minutes, so we'll definitely have to get you on in the not distant future again to discuss some more about this. But thank you so much for being on the show. Of course, people can go to gralienreport.com to read more about your stuff, but is there something else you would like to point people to look at?
Yeah, sure. I mean, people can check out my website, micahhanks.com, and that has links to all my podcasts, which, again, the 7 Ages Audio Journal, Middle Theory, and Gralien Report. And lastly, I just want to say it's always great to catch up and talk with you, Alejandro, although, like you said, the time goes faster than a speeding tic-tac.
It does. And they move pretty quickly, I hear.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
And thank you, sir.
Thank you so much to Micah Hanks for joining us on the show again. He is awesome. He's such a great thinker. He's got such a great radio voice, too. It's always a lot of fun to talk with Micah, and it's fun to hang out with him. He's really a funny guy. But other news, just so you know, actually, in just the last few minutes, Tom DeLonge has actually replied to the Stars funding issue that Martin and I were talking about at the beginning of the show. So go to the Open Minds UFO Facebook group, and you'll be able to see that. Or you could, of course, go to Tom DeLonge's Facebook page, and you'll see his response also. Otherwise, be sure to check out UFO Seriously. That's the YouTube live news show that I do every Thursday at 6 p.m. Arizona time, which is currently aligned with Pacific, but we cover all the UFO news there, so you can check that out on YouTube, UFO Seriously Live. You can also check out my Patreon site, and please do. You'll see my space stories and other stories there, and then at ufocongress.com, of course, you can read the latest about the UFO Congress, including going to the store where you could get cool UFO and alien products, and the videos on demand where you can watch all the lectures. In fact, we have all the lectures up for the 2018 UFO Congress. You can go watch them at the videos on demand. Of course, you can find all of this also at openminds.tv, including the news that Martin and I were talking about at the top of the show. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll also see a link to the video portal that I was just referring to, and you can join our email list to keep up to date on the latest. So, thank you again to Micah Hanks for joining us. Thank you to his brother Caleb Hanks for the opening and close music that you hear and love every week. Thank you to Martin Willis of Podcast UFO for joining us with the news. Thank you to Systematics for the bumper music. And of course, thank you, the listeners, for being here once again. Wonderful to see you. Oh, by the way, if you're in the Baltimore area in November, the 9th to the 11th, I'll be speaking at AlienCon. So you can also find out more about that. Just Google AlienCon. Anyway, I hope to see you there. I will talk to you again soon. We'll talk to you on the show next week. Until then, adios, muchachos.
Your emotion